So hello everyone, welcome back to another class in AI Chatbot Masterclass. And this class is the most special, the most important class. I know you have been waiting for this because you'll start learning about Dialogflow context. And Dialogflow context is actually one of the most important things that you'll be learning in this whole course. Let's start it off. So there's one tagline that I use always is, if entities were magic, we just said, right, the magic of entities. Context is actually the king of all the features that Dialogflow gives you. And why is that? You'll be getting to know in this set of lectures. So before we go on to what is Dialogflow context, what is context in the terms of Dialogflow, we need to understand what is the actual meaning of context in real life. And if I go to Google and if I search for what is the meaning of context or context meaning, I can see it is written out something like that the circumstances that form the setting for an event, state or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. And that is what context means. Context is something that sets up a state, sets up the platform, sets up the environment, and then you're doing the talking basically. So let's understand what is context in real life. And if I give you a very small example, you can always remember that, whenever you're talking to an old friend and you bring up something topic like, you remember that beautiful memory we had in college or school, and we used to have fun like anything. We used to be in class, we used to disturb the teachers, the teacher used to throw us out and all that stuff, right? And now the context is being set here, and first of all, the context for this class has been set. And now all the discussions you're going to do, so now you're going to say that, okay, that happened in this class and this happened in that class. The context of your college memories has been set. The context here is our college memories and our class memories, right? And after that, now all the discussion you're doing out there, you both understand that what the other person is actually talking about. And that is how it is basically. Whenever we are talking, we keep setting up the context, we keep driving the conversation, and context actually sets up the flow. Suppose you go to a party, the conversations are different, the context is different, right? Suppose you go to a professional meeting, the context is different, and so are the conversations. I hope we understand now what is context when it comes to real life. It matters a lot. So context is something that brings flow in life, okay? So like suppose we both today have a very common context, our conversations that are happening are in context of AI Chatbot Masterclass, are in context of Dialogflow. We understand that the context I'm going to talk about is some kind of a feature in Dialogflow also that will be helping us in chatbot building. So this is the context that we're setting. And also when I'm saying the word user, it doesn't mean that any kind of user or any kind of person who comes to an app, which is the basic definition of user. You understand that I'm talking in terms of users coming to your chat assistant, and that is what we have already set the context in many forms. So that helps you drive conversations, that is helping you build conversations, that is helping you flow conversations through. Let's get to see how it is actually useful, how will you be using context, and what benefits does context give you. So first benefit that context is going to give you is it will help you build multiple intents with the same training phrases. Now this has always been a problem, right? You can't build multiple intents with the same training phrases. Now first of all, before that, why do we need to build multiple intents with the same training phrases? You will need to build multiple intents with the same training phrases. Let's say I go to buy some music instruments. There's a guitar, there's a piano, there's a tabla, okay? And now what happens is basically when I'm choosing amongst these three, guitar, piano, tabla, I actually come to a point where I need to ask the question, what is the price of this? And now you see here that you didn't actually say tabla in this training phrase. You just said what is the price of this. That means somewhere you had chosen tabla before and you now are asking in that context that what is the price of this tabla. You won't be telling tabla again and again in each and every training phrase. You will just be saying that what is the price of this, and the same training phrase basically will go to each of these intents. Now you need a same training phrase for tabla also, you need a same training phrase for guitar also, you need a same training phrase for piano also. In this manner you have multiple intents which have the same training phrases, but they flow around with different context. Next is helps you build less follow-up style intents for multiple flows. Now we understood in all these classes that there was one problem coming up, right? That we have suppose 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 intents where we are using the same type of exactly same follow-up intents. Suppose there are 20 intents and after those 20 intents you have to ask for the same follow-up intent. You have to go for the same follow-up intent. And now you would have to create again 20 follow-up intents. But when you will have context, you will understand that how you can just sum this up in with 1 or 2 follow-up intents, and mostly 1 follow-up intent basically if they are the same. And that is quite possible. You can improve your efficiency, you can expand things, you can change the flow of the conversation. Helps you transfer the parameter value from one intent to another. We'll be taking up this in the next lecture. This is the golden thing with context. It helps you transfer the parameter value from one intent to another, and that is what you all have been looking for. You all were asking, that how can we use $name in any other intent when I have collected it. It is only being used currently in this particular intent. Now how do we do that? That is what we'll be covering up in the next lecture. In this lecture we'll be seeing up the basics first. You can control the order of intent matching. This is again one of the most important things. You can actually control now which intent gets matched. Okay, if you have multiple intents with the training phrases, with context you can actually control that which intent should be matched. Busy flow actually helps you drive complex flows. Now you don't need to have everything in the training phrase. You don't need to speak up the whole thing. You can speak up the half, rest can be in the context, the environment is set, your assistant understands the user within the conversation. This makes your assistant smart. This is the power of context. It brings understandability to a system, and this is one simple reason why I love context so much. When systems start understanding you, that is the best thing, right? That is what humans need actually. That is it understanding me? Is it getting to know me within the conversation? Is it getting a bit smarter? Is it, personalizing things according to me? And that is the most important thing. And this is what context brings to your assistant. When you go to Dialogflow, you will see context on the top of your intent, okay? And that is here, you can see two things out there. There's an input context and there is an output context. We'll be taking you through what is an input context and output context, and how does context look like. Context always looks like bliss. So how does context work? First of all, contexts are strings. Contexts are words, you can say simply, or contexts are strings, okay? Nothing too much big of a thing. As you can see here again, context, I have written context name is bliss out here, right? And this is set up as an output context. And we need to understand what are output context, okay? What is happening whenever you are setting up an output context to a particular intent? As you can see in the previous intent, I actually set up bliss as an output context. What is actually happening once I set up bliss as an output context? This output context is actually setting up the space, okay? This sets up the context basically. It activates the context, if I would say. Once this intent is now fired, okay, once this intent is now triggered, okay, this output context becomes active. This is the role of output context. It makes a context string active, okay, once that intent is triggered, okay, very simple. And this is a huge role to play, that you need someone to activate a context, and that is what output context is going to do for you, okay. Next is input context. Okay, now when you are adding an input context to a particular intent, you are adding some kind of a preference. Okay, now you remember, right, in follow-up intents we used to say that if this follow-up intent is being matched, you need to have the previous intent to be triggered first, and that was the condition for the follow-up intent to be triggered, right? In the same manner, we can consider that if any intent has an input context, okay, that means it will be triggered only when the same context is already active. I hope you understand now. Let's say I am having 5 intents, okay. There are 2 intents which have an input context X. Now what will happen here is these 2 intents will only be triggered, and we understand intents are only triggered when the training phrases match. Intent cannot be triggered by any other thing. You can't trigger an intent using just context. Intent is triggered when training phrases are matched, and these 2 intents have input context as X. And now it is very clear that these 2 intents will only be matched if X is already an active context, and for that you will need to have X in some other intent's output context, and you will need to trigger those intents before you try to trigger these intents, or else these intents won't be triggered, right? So adding input context helps you control the order of intent matching, and in some way now you are controlling the order of intent matching. Training phase will be more preferably matched if there is an active context that is same as input context. By adding an input context, you are also limiting the intent to be fired only when the context is active. Great. So we understood, first we are activating a context with an output context, and then with the input context we are saying that if there is an active context, then only these intents will be matched. Okay. And there is now one other thing that comes up called lifespan. Let me show you something. So you can see here, when there is written bliss, there is something written 5 out here, right? Now what does this 5 stands for? This 5 actually stands for lifespan. Let's understand what is lifespan. Now each active context, okay, each active context has a lifespan that defines the number of conversational turns for which the context remains active. Okay, so we understand what is a conversational turn. One conversational turn means that one response from Dialogflow, one question from the user. This complete set of 2 messages is one conversational turn. Okay, now if I am setting up the lifespan for 5, that means from when I have triggered that particular intent which has an output context, if the lifespan is 5, for the next 5 conversational turns, this context remains active. Okay, so the default lifespan is 5 conversational turns for normal intents and 2 conversational turns for follow-up intents. And now I'll tell you to go to follow-up intents and see what's happening out there. We won't be taking up this in this session. We'll be taking this up in the next session, because I need you to go through what's happening through follow-up intents. Actually, follow-up intents are not follow-up intents. They are just contextual intents. They are just 2 intents binded together with a proper context, with an output context and an input context. So you see, whenever you add a follow-up intent, there is an output context that is added in the primary intent, and there is an input context that is added in the follow-up intent, and that's it, and they call it a follow-up intent. And when I'm saying that the lifespan for follow-up intent is 2 conversational turns, that means for the next 2 conversations this context is active and the follow-up is active actually, right? So you can override the default lifespan for any context. You can change this default lifespan. You can put it to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever number you feel like. In addition to this, all contexts expire after 20 minutes of becoming active. So let's suppose what happens is there is an intent that has a lifespan of 5. That just means 5 conversational turns. Okay. Now what you do, you come to an assistant and you just start a conversation and you make 2 conversations. Okay. You just made 2 conversations, the context was active, but after 20 minutes, if you type something now you won't be getting answer in that context, because Dialogflow from its system will expire that particular active context. When an intent is matched with an output context that is already active, the lifespan and expiration timer are reset. Okay. Let's say you have 5 intents which have output context, okay, which have the same output context, I would say. And now whenever you are triggering these 5 intents one after one, this lifespan gets refreshed, this expiration timer gets refreshed. So it's a very good thing, right, that whenever you are firing an intent that has the same output context, again it starts off like, again those 5 turns will start from 1, and then the lifetime, you know, the expiration timer will also start from 0 minutes, and then it goes on till 20 minutes. So for the timing when your user is having that conversation, these things get refreshed and the user gets more context by and by. Great.